Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Ray from the Bloomfield Public Library. Thank you for joining us for our first Opera Talk program in the series. So we have Jeffrey here going to let us know everything about Medea. On to you, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome to Medea. That's actually not from Medea, but it is by its composer. See if I can get this right. Maria Luigi Carlo Zenobio Salvatore Cherubini. That's all one person. And we're dealing with an opera that is what I would call sort of on the fringe of the fringe of the fringe of the repertory. It's not an opera that you hear very often, and went for a long time not being heard really anywhere outside of, believe it or not, Germany or German-speaking countries. Cherubini, who was during his lifetime a highly respected composer. In fact, Beethoven, there's a quote from Beethoven in 1805, they would meet in Vienna. Among all living opera composers, Cherubini is for me the most deserving of respect. And then 12 years later, would call him the greatest living composer, that coming from the greatest living composer. So that's quite a compliment. Very skillful, underwent a long period of study. Just lacks that certain spark in his music that would differentiate him or put him, let's say, in the same class as Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, three of his contemporaries. If we look at his life briefly, he's born in 1760 in Firenze, Florence. His father, Bartolomeo Cherubini, was the harpsichord player of the Teatro della Pergola, very old theater in Florence, opens in 1657, still active today. And Cherubini was rather precocious, begins study with his father at the age of 6 of just music in general, and at age 9 is studying composition. At age 13, composes a mass which gets a public performance. And by the age of 16, he's composed 3 masses, a Te Deum, a Miserere, 3 cantatas, an oratorio, and some other sacred works. After his father, he's going to study with 5 different teachers. And his period of study extends from the age of 6 in 1766 till 1781. So he really was truly well instructed. And his last teacher would be the most prestigious, a composer by name of Giuseppe Salti. He was born in 1729, dies in 1802. During his day, a very successful popular composer, wrote 82 operas. Today, you're not going to hear them. And if his name remains known at all, it'd only be if you're an expert on Don Giovanni by Mozart. And you come to the final scene, we have this great banquet in the Hall of the Dons. He's having a banquet for himself, and he has a little band playing music to entertain him. And the first piece they play is an excerpt from an opera by Martini Soler, who was a popular composer of opera at that time that Giovanni was being premiered in 1787. The second little tune is by Salti, coming from one of his operas, and apparently was a very popular tune of the day. And the third tune is Non più andrai, which you would know better as Bam Padam Bam Padam Bam Padam. And I remember the first time I heard this at the Met, and I didn't know the opera very well. I was quite perplexed. What is the Marriage of Figaro doing in Don Giovanni? But that was Mozart joking with himself and with the audience. Marriage of Figaro was premiered just the year before Don Giovanni. But that's how you might know the name of Salti. But apparently he was a very good teacher, and during his study with him, Cherubini is going to get an opera performed in Alexandria at the age of 19. Part of his learning process with Salti was to write arias for Salti that sometimes would be incorporated into Salti's own operas, and he would also serve as a copyist. Well, he's going to complete his study with him in 1781 and returns to Firenze. In between, going back to 1779 and 1784, composes 9 operas that apparently had some success, and he's going to build a certain reputation in Italy. But by 1784, he gets the itch to travel, and he goes up to London. And he'll remain there for 3 years, composes 3 operas that are performed, not highly successful, but people recognize that he is very talented. It seems, one source says, and I haven't seen this in any other sources, that for a year he was the composer to the king, would have been George III. But he does become a member of the intimate cultural circle surrounding the Prince of Wales, later to become George IV, who was a lover of music. In the summer of 1785, he takes a trip to Paris, and there he meets Giovanni Battista Viotti, who was one of the most renowned violinists of the day, and Viotti will introduce him to Marie Antoinette. Well, he'll return to London, but then he's going to fix himself permanently in Paris in 1786. And financially, he's going to go through a period of struggle. Now, in 1789, Viotti, together with the hairdresser, perfumer of Marie Antoinette, are going to get a license to open a theater to produce Italian opera. This theater is going to be called Le Théâtre de Monsieur, and it'll be in the Palais des Tuileries. Now, this is a palace that doesn't exist anymore. It's a 16th century palace that was built at what today is the end of the Louvre. So if you're going from east to west, the east, of course, has the oldest part of the Louvre with the Cour Carrée. And then you keep going west, and you come to that rectangular horseshoe. And there was a connecting building at the two ends of the horseshoe, which was the Palais des Tuileries. And the royal family would reside there and in parts of the Louvre. Don't forget, the Louvre opens as a museum in the early 1790s. But the palace is going to burn down during the Commune of 1871, so that's why you don't see it today. Just see the gardens. And Cherubini, for this new theater, is going to become the director, the conductor, the person who rehearses. They're going to perform operas or opera buffa by well-known composers of the day like Cimarosa and Paisiello. And you have then in July of 1789, of course, Le 14 Juillet, the 14th, the beginning of the revolution with the storming of the Bastille. And you have the royal family, for the most part, is living in Versailles. And after the Bastille, you have the so-called hungry mob that descends on Versailles and forces the royal family to move back to Paris and live in the Tuileries. Well, it can no longer serve as a theater. So this theater is going to move elsewhere and is going to, at one point, wind up on the Rue Feydeau and becomes known as Le Théâtre de Feydeau and continues to produce operas there. In 1791, Cherubini produces one of his own operas, Lodoiska, which will get some 200 consecutive performances, so very successful. He'll follow that with a second opera, Elise. Not sure if it was a success or not, but it'll be again at the Théâtre Feydeau. And then in 1797 we get Medea, also at the theater, not successful, which we'll get into a little bit later on. And then he has his last major operatic success, Les Deux Journées, in 1800. So it's a good cutoff point for him. From his first opera, 1779 to 1800, he composes 22 operas, and most of them having some sort of success. But after 1800, he's writing fewer operas and having less and less success. One of the reasons there are fewer operas. So there'll be another 12 after 1800, including 1800. Now, backtracking a little, to help his financial situation, because the pay, I guess, wasn't very good at the Théâtre Feydeau, we come to an individual named Bernard Sarret, double R, double T. He's born in 1765, dies in 1858. Not a musician, was an administrator. And after the storming of the Bastille, he is given the role of creating a national guard, a national military guard. And then, soon thereafter, a military band that would accompany it. So this would be your typical military band. You would have piccolos, flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, French horns, trumpets, and drums. And after that exists for a while, it's decided that what they need is a school, or a military music school, to produce more musicians for the band. So he's charged with that, and we are going to have the opening of the first school for military music in France. Then it's realized that, well, we also need some instruction for string players and for voices. And so the school would expand to include those two categories. And that leads in 1795 to the establishment of the Conservatoire de Paris, which is, let's say, I'll call it the first great conservatory in Europe, and will continue to be one of the great ones throughout the 19th century. Very important school, served as a model for other countries. And they will include the 5 most prominent composers of operas in France. So you'll have Etienne Méhul, André Crétry, Eugène Gossec, I'm leaving out one, François Lesueur, who was the teacher of Berlioz, and also Cherubini. And from 1795 until his death in 1842, at least 1 month before his death that year, he's going to have close connections to the conservatory, either as an inspecteur or in 1822, when we have a reorganization of the conservatory a little bit before, he becomes its director, and for 20 years, and a very influential director, very conservative. Not everybody liked him, but he was a very important director, and he would also help to reorganize the conservatory. Now, backtracking a bit, we get to this period at the beginning of the 19th century. He's not in great spirits. He was prone to depression. These are going to get worse after 1800. One source of the depression was Napoleon. And we think of Napoleon as this great military commander, but he had his fingers in everything, including the arts. He would dictate which operas would be performed at l'Opéra. They would be according to his taste of what he thought was good opera. He had his fingers in Paris theaters, and he would designate l'Opéra was the #1 theater. Secondary theater would be l'Odéon. The Comédie Française for plays was the #1 theater for there. And if you wanted to open any other theaters of less importance, you had to get his permission. And there was quite an hierarchy, you can't pronounce it, of theaters in Paris, always depending on the blessing of Napoleon. Well, he didn't like Cherubini's music. And I do have a quote of a supposed conversation between the two of them. I hope it's not part of a myth. But Napoleon said to Cherubini, And this is when he was first consul, so it's sometime between 1799 and 1804, because in 1804 he becomes emperor. And Napoleon says to Cherubini, "You have great talent, citoyen, citizen Cherubini, but your music is too loud. Let us talk of Paisiello's, which lulls me gently." Cherubini should have kept his mouth shut, but instead he says, "I understand, citoyen consul. You prefer music that does not prevent you from dreaming of affairs of state." This did not help Cherubini's cause, and he's not going to get his operas produced at l'Opéra, and he's going to start suffering these bouts of depression. Before he has a major one, he is going to go to Vienna in July of 1805. 3 years previous, they'd offered a season of his operas in Vienna, which were highly acclaimed. And he's very similar to Berlioz in that his music was much more popular outside of Paris and France than it was within. Berlioz had the same problem. When Berlioz went on tour and he performed his music in Central Europe, everyone was just ecstatic, rave reviews. But his music wasn't heard that often in Paris. Nobody wanted to play it. And it's a bit similar with Cherubini. He had great success in German-speaking countries, of course with German translations. So after this successful season, he's invited to Vienna, gets there in July of 1805, and he will meet Beethoven, he will meet Haydn. Apparently he saw quite a bit of Beethoven. He was asked, "What did you think of Beethoven?" And his phrase was, "Il était toujours brusque." He was always very abrupt. No detail as to what he meant, but that's what we know of what he thought of Beethoven. Apparently he liked the music. We don't have any negative criticism, and as you know, Beethoven thought very highly of Cherubini's music. So, unfortunately for him, in November of 1805, guess who conquers Vienna? Napoleon. And for some reason, Napoleon sort of stretches out the olive branch and asks Cherubini to organize musical soirees at the Schönbrunn Palace, the great palace in Vienna, where Napoleon was residing. Of course, he couldn't say no to that, and he would organize some evenings. And then Napoleon invites him back to Paris. So he returned to Paris, supposedly on the good side of Napoleon, but not having success with his music. And he goes into this mental downturn. And he's going to abandon composition for a while and pick up the study of flowers, botany. He's going to build his own herbarium in his apartment. And in 1808, he's invited to a chateau in southern Belgium, Chateau de Chimay, or Chimay. And this was a chateau that belonged to a whole succession of counts and princes dating back to the 15th century. Now, one of his pupils, Daniel François Esprit Aubert, was a regular at the chateau, would spend several months a year there because the current prince, he was prince number 16, was an actor, amateur actor, I guess, and there would be productions, and Aubert, I guess, would write some music for it. And Aubert and Cherubini, who were very close, Aubert thought this would be good for Cherubini to get away from it all and come up to Chimay. By the way, that prince married one of the most beautiful women of the day, a French woman by the name, I forget her name, Madame Renier or so. Don't quote me on that. Who was quite a character. 3 husbands, numerous lovers, and 11 children. The last 3 coming from the prince, and by then she settled down and they lived happily ever after together. So up goes Cherubini for a while to the chateau, and somebody convinces him to write a mass for the consecration of a church in town. And reluctantly he does so, but it's very well received. And he embarks on sort of the second part of his career, which is a composer of sacred music and instrumental music. And he'll write another 7 masses. There are 6 string quartets. There's a symphony. He'll be commissioned in 1816 by the Philharmonic Society of London to compose a symphony, and he'll go to London to hear it, as well as a big concert overture. Writing some operas, but again, they're not being very well received. And then he is going to become very much involved in his duties at the Conservatoire. Now, as a person, who was Cherubini? I only came across this morning. He was apparently much beloved by his pupils. But there was another side of him that was, well, he wasn't a happy man always. He did get married and have 3 children. But the sentence I get out of that gives me the sense that it wasn't a very happy marriage. She was kind of a shrewish woman. But he was greatly respected by his pupils, and one of them was Halévy, who wrote La Juive, who had great respect for him. And when Cherubini was in his last days and, of course, extremely ill, Halévy was there at his bedside to see him through it. But there was also the composer Adolphe Adam, who's best remembered today for the ballet Giselle. And in his Souvenir d'un musicien's autobiography or memoirs, he gives a description of him, which would be the following: extremely highly strung, abrupt, like Beethoven, irritable, like Beethoven, completely independent. His first reactions were nearly always unfavorable. He quickly regained his natural disposition, which was excellent, and which he tried to conceal under the most forbidding exterior. So, despite his unevenness of temper, but in parentheses, some maintain that his temper was very even because he was always angry, close parentheses, he was worshipped by those who were close to him. Now, he would make at least one rather questionable decision. And this is when the young Franz Liszt comes to the conservatory to be admitted as a pupil. Now, this will be in December of 1823. Liszt is 12 years old or 11 years old. He's already an acclaimed pianist. He'd made his debut at the age of 9. And his father, who's in a way another Leopold Mozart, knew he had a prodigy on his hands, and he would follow the same tour schedule as 6-year-old Mozart. So after Vienna, he would go to Augsburg, he'd go to Stuttgart, he would go to Munich, he'd go to Frankfurt, just like Mozart had, and was acclaimed everywhere, and then wound up like Mozart in Paris, and is banging on the door of the Conservatoire. Now, he was introduced by the 2 Erard, I never can pronounce that name, brothers, that's E-R-A-R-D, great piano manufacturers. And in fact, the Liszts would inhabit lodgings right opposite their factory and became very close to them. And one of the brothers, Sebastian, would introduce Liszt to Cherubini. This is already one of the great pianists of Europe, and he is turned down by Cherubini because he was a foreigner. Well, what was Cherubini? And yet, poor Liszt has to go away, and he goes to London, etc. And in essence, Cherubini gets his comeuppance, and that 13-year-old Liszt composes an opera which will be produced at l'Opéra, someone that was refused entry to the Conservatoire just 2 years previous. Now, it's not entirely Cherubini's fault, because apparently, just a couple of weeks before the arrival of Liszt, the government had passed a decree limiting or even banning, in some cases, foreigners being admitted to the Conservatoire. The Conservatoire had developed such a great reputation, everybody wanted to study there, and in particular pianists. And the piano department was simply overflowing, and it was supposed to be a conservatory first for French nationals, so that would have something to do with it. And yet later on in 1833, we have Jacques Offenbach coming with his father. He's a foreigner from Cologne, and he was accepted, but I guess the cello class was smaller than the piano class, and so he was let in. So Cherubini gets some bad publicity because of this, but he also gets some terrible publicity from Berlioz. And, oops, let me see, where's my marker? And it's in the memoirs that he is going to make fun of Cherubini in a terrible way, and is pretty much going to be the picture of him that we have today, which might not be entirely right. I'm going to read you this segment. I find this very amusing. Nobody else does, but I do. Berlioz, who's a wonderful writer, again, I've mentioned in the past, distant past at the library, the memoirs, this is a great reading. Very easy, not too technical musically, wonderful sense of imagination and sense of humor. And he tells the story of, this is before he's studying at the Conservatory, and Berlioz was going to the library to study the scores of Gluck, the opera composer. And just before he started to attend go to the library, there was a decree passed by Cherubini that wanted to have the complete separation of the sexes. So, at one far end of the conservatory, you had the entrance for the men, or the boys, and at the other far side, you would have the entrance for the girls. And Berlioz, who thought this was utterly ridiculous, goes to the Conservatoire and intentionally goes through the women's entrance. And he's crossing the courtyard, and he's intercepted by the porter who has seen this. His name was Autain, with an H. And he says, no, you've got to turn around, go back through the courtyard, out the entrance, go all the way around the conservatory, and come through the men's entrance. And Berlioz told him to go fly a kite, whereupon Autain, who wanted to be in the good graces of Cherubini, immediately went to him and told him what had happened. Meanwhile, you've got Berlioz in the library studying, and we have the arrival of Cherubini, and we have Autain who says, that's him. And Cherubini was so angry that for the moment he could not speak. Now, this is going to sound a little strange when I read this, because one of the great aspects of these memoirs is that Berlioz imitates the accents of the people involved. And Cherubini had a very thick Italian accent when he spoke French, so this is what you're going to hear. So it's you, he cried at last with a strong Italian accent made more grotesque by his fury. It is you who come in by the door I will not have you use. Sir, I was not aware of the new regulation. Another time I will conform to it. Another time. What are you doing here? As you see, sir, I am studying Gluck scores. And what are Gluck scores to you? Where did you get permission to come to the library? Sir, I was beginning to lose my self-possession. Gluck scores are the finest examples of dramatic music. He's saying that to Cherubini, who was a dramatic composer. I know, and I need no one's permission to come here and study them. The conservatory library is open to the public from 10 to 3, and I have the right to use it. The right? Yes, sir. I will not allow you to return. I shall return nonetheless. What is your name? He yelled, shaking with rage. Sir, I answered, growing pale in my turn, my name will perhaps be familiar to you one day, but you will not have it now. Seize him, Autain, he cried to the porter. I'll have him in prison. Thereupon, to the stupefaction of the onlookers, the two of them, master and servant, began pursuing me round the table, knocking over stools and reading desks in a vain attempt to catch me. In the end, I made my escape, calling out with a laugh as I fled, you shan't have me or my name, and I shall soon be back here to study Gluck scores. That was my first encounter with Cherubini. I think that's quite wonderful. He'll have another one later on when he wants to use the hall of the Conservatoire, and Cherubini refuses it. Now he knows who he is, of course, because he's been enrolled formally in the conservatory. And he goes over Cherubini's head by writing a letter to the Minister of the Arts. And in the letter says that Cherubini is a stumbling block to his use of the hall, and once again imitates the accent of Cherubini. And Berlioz was told a few weeks later, after he'd sent the letter off to the minister, that the minister still couldn't stop laughing from it, and he did get to use the hall. Well, why don't we listen to a little bit of music? This is the overture, which is a really good piece. In fact, I think it's the best thing in the opera. So it's a bit long, but it's a good piece, worth hearing. So, overture to Medea. Now, aside from knowing almost all the major musicians of the day, Cherubini also had a very good friendship with the painter Ingres, sort of the last of the great neoclassical painters. And they get to know each other during the 1820s. Ingres, who loved music, was a violinist, would have musical soirees in his home with his wife, who's a pianist, would accompany him. Apparently he and Cherubini would play together. And Ingres will do a portrait of Cherubini, which I think is the only one we have, maybe one you've seen, which is the following. That's the muse Erato, who's the muse of lyric poetry and eroticism. And this was painted just before his death in 1842. Apparently, Ingres only did the head, he also did the muse, but the hands and the body were done by a pupil, and the hands were actually the hands of Charles Gounod, the composer, and Ingres had done a sketch of him at the keyboard the previous year. Well, there he is. Looks a bit cantankerous. So we come to Medea. I had said before that the opera was not a huge success. It'll be premiered 1797, only gets 20 performances. The librettist was François Benoit Hoffmann, with an H. Was born the same year as Cherubini in 1760, dies in 1828. Wrote some 26 libretti, was also a critic and playwright. Was a critic for Les Débats, which was a very important daily in France. Berlioz would become its music critic in 1833, and it was noted for its criticism in drama and literature, and with Berlioz, of course, music. Now, the story is going to be based on a couple of sources. One is the Euripides play of 431 BC, which actually only covers half the story. Then there was a play in 1635 by Pierre Corneille, who's considered the French Shakespeare, certainly the greatest of the classical classical French playwrights. He was born in 1606, dies in 1684. And there was also a play by Ovid, if you've ever read The Metamorphoses, great reading, all of the Greek myths. But that play has disappeared. We only have 2 lines from it, but maybe back then they had more. And it's going to serve as a basis for the storyline for several operas. The first I've come across was 1697 by Marc-Antoine Charpentier, who's pretty much known today for his Te Deum and not much else. Then there was an opera in, I think, 1713 by a completely obscure composer of just 2 operas named Solomon. Then comes Cherubini. And then in the 20th century, we have 2 versions. Darius Milhaud does one in 1939, and just a few years ago, 1964, Ernst Krenek, another version. He's best known for Johnny Spielt Auf, which is considered to be the first jazz opera, or opera to use jazz idioms. This is before Porgy and Bess. So it's not going to have much success for Cherubini in Paris or in France. But it is going to be taken up in Berlin in 1800 and be a part of the Berlin repertory until around 1880. In 1854, we have a composer named Franz Lachner, born 1803, dies in 1890, who was a member of Schubert's intimate circle, knew Beethoven, settles in Munich in 1835, and becomes an important musician in Munich for the next 30 years or so. Conductor, composer. Then Wagner comes to town, and they didn't get on very well. Well, who did with Wagner? And Lachner didn't care for Wagner's music, though he did give the Munich premieres of Lohengrin and Tannhäuser, and he pretty much retires in 1865. Now, he's going to write German recitatives for Medea. Medea is labeled an opera comique, not because it's funny and it's anything but it is in the style of an opera comique where you have the alternation of music and dialogue. And this would be spoken dialogue. And this is one reason, for instance, it couldn't be done at l'Opéra, because at l'Opéra in Paris, everything had to be music. It didn't necessarily have to be sung music like arias or duets, but what we call recitative, the sort of singy, songy speaking with very small instrumental accompaniment. And so you're going to get a version of German recitatives by Lachner for a production in Frankfurt in 1855. It is going to come to London in 1865. Now we get Italian recitatives by Luigi Cherubini, who, if he is remembered today, it's for a song called Il Bacio. Doesn't have great success in London, and by the mid-1870s it's out of the repertory. Comes to La Scala in 1909, not at all successful, and it finally achieves some popularity due to one singer, and that would be Maria Callas, and she's going to have a production of it done in Florence in 1952, and this gives new life to the opera. It's going to come to New York. The first performance, and it's not even a stage performance, it's a concert performance, is in 1955 at Town Hall with, believe it or not, Eileen Farrell as Medea and James McCracken. For the opera lovers who remember him, he was a very fine Otello. And in 1958 it gets a first stage performance in San Francisco and a first stage performance in New York in 1974 at City Opera with Marilyn Niska as Medea. I didn't have a chance to look this up. I believe, didn't she get into trouble that she did Salome, and during the Dance of the Seven Veils she took off all the veils? I've got to look her up. I've got this faint memory of that. The first of several to come. Not memories, but those that like to take off their veils. And so that takes us to the story, which I'm having great difficulties keeping up in my head. We come to Medea, who was a sorceress, and she was the daughter of the king of Colchis, Acetes, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Colchis, which is on the eastern end of the Black Sea, and to its north you have the Caucasus Mountains. Now this is all background information. You're not going to get this in the opera. This is the original Greek myth, and you're going to get then a lot of the subsequent information from at least the Euripides play. So she's the daughter of King Acetes. She's also the niece of Circe, who was a sorceress goddess. And if you remember the Odyssey, at one point Odysseus has his men turned to swine by Circe. Jason is the son of, I pronounce it, Aeolus, and he is the king of, I always get this confused, Iolcus. And Aeseus is going to have his throne usurped by his half-brother-in-law, Peleus, not to be confused with Peleus of Peleus and Melisande. We're in a different era. And young Jason is sent off for his safety, but returns as an adult and confronts Peleus, wants the throne back for his father or for himself, and Peleus says, fine, but only if you bring me the golden fleece. The golden fleece was in the garden of Ares in Colchis, and this is where, of course, Medea resided. And so he's going to go to Argus, who is a helmsman shipbuilder, builds a great vessel, which will be called the Argo, and he hires the 50 greatest warriors in Greece, which, depending on your version of the myth, can include Heracles, or to include what's his name, Orpheus, who wasn't really a warrior, but they needed someone to entertain them by song and dance. And off they go to Colchis. And Acetes is willing to give up the fleece, but only if Jason performs certain rather impossible tasks, which he's able to do with the help of the magic of Medea. And now they've become lovers, and they return to Iolcus. And Medea, who was a rather nasty, vengeful person, is going to seek vengeance for Jason on Peleus. And she shows to his daughters that they can rejuvenate their father, bringing him back to his youthful form. And she shows by taking Acetes and placing him in a cauldron. No, Acetes is her father. Iasus puts him in a cauldron of boiling water, not too hot, and places in it magic herbs, and he's restored to his more youthful days. The daughters of Peleus see that. They do the same with their father, but the herbs they're given aren't effective, and instead, by accident, they kill him. So it's their brother that's then going to chase Medea and Jason out of the kingdom. And they wind up, or at least Jason winds up in Corinth. And that's when this opera starts. And this is the Euripides play. And in Corinth, Jason has lost Medea, probably has just become tired of her barbaric nature, has had 2 sons by him, has his 2 sons with him, and wants to marry the daughter of the king of Corinth. And he is very ambitious, and this would be a step up for him. And so in Act 1, you have the preparations for the marriage, but then halfway through the act, Medea appears. She's disguised and then reveals herself, kind of to the horror of everyone, and to King Creon, the father of the daughter who's going to be the wife-to-be, says Jason is his, those are her sons, and he gets really nervous, and he banishes her from the realm to start instantly. And she begs with him, give me 24 hours, at least 24 hours to say goodbye to my sons. And the end of the act ends with a very tense duet between Jason and Medea, where she's cursing him and calling on the gods of Hades and the gods of Olympus to condemn the marriage, etc., etc. Well, in the second act, once again, she's out for revenge, and she poisons quite an extravagant robe and some jewels and a crown, and gives them as gifts to Dirce, the daughter of King Creon, the intended wife of Jason. And of course she's going to put on the robe and the crowns and the jewels, and you're going to hear the shrieks. I don't know if you'll hear them, but there will be shrieks coming from the palace as she dies. And to make things worse, she has her nurse, Neris, accompany the 2 boys who give the gifts to, her name is Glauce in this version. And let me just come to the last act, where she's still out for revenge against Jason. And in the temple where the marriage was to take place, she murders her sons. Her thinking in part, aside from just revenge on Jason, is also that she thinks it's better that she murders them, because after what she has done to Creon's daughter, Creon will probably have them murdered anyway. So she does it. And at the conclusion of the act, Jason comes to the temple. She rises in the air. She curses him that he's going to be a wanderer on the earth for the rest of his life, homeless. And when he dies, he will join her in Hades. And off she goes. And according to Euripides, she goes to Athens, where she's given sanctuary by the king Aegeus. That's pretty much her story. In this version, for those that are going to the Met, you may have read the review. Once again, we're changing venues, and this is going to take place in the early 19th century. I guess the logic is because that was the time of Cherubini, but it wasn't the time of Medea. I just don't understand these things. I've given up trying to. So I thought I'd conclude with the duet to close out Act 1, where you've got Medea feuding with with Jason. Gets rather nasty. And you'll notice that you don't really get a sense of it when you listen to the music. I would have expected fireworks in the orchestra, and you really don't have it. But here they are. This is Maria Callas with a tenor I've never heard of. His name is... what is his name? Mirto Picchi. And here we go. In the Act 2, 2 acts to go, but not for us. That'll be it for today. Next month, I can't say happier things, but at least a little more pleasant. Music-wise, we'll do La Traviata. There's been a change of schedule at the Met. It was supposed to be Don Carlos, but that Russian soprano Tremko, who's been banned from the Met, was supposed to sing in that, so they canceled the production, and it's going to be replaced by Falstaff in April. So we'll just do Traviata in November. So, are there any questions?